Perfect. Okay. We will just give it a couple of minutes to let people trickle in. I'd say maybe 1 or 2 more minutes before we kind of get started here.
Great. I'm yours for the hour, so you go ahead and lead.
Great. All right, let's get started. Okay, so welcome everyone who's joining us live today. We will have a recording that we'll send afterwards as well. As most of you know, I'm Linta. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders alongside Dr. Ojibora of Vitract. Today, we're very lucky to have Andrew from Case Specific Nutrition with us. Andrew, why don't we start with a quick introduction so we can get to know you?
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Wade. I am a registered dietitian. I'm here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as sort of my flag to plant. I run a dietitian private practice called Case Specific Nutrition. We are a 10 location group practice that specializes in meeting people where they are and supporting them through habits and interventions to work their way forward from survive to thrive. So that is a little bit about me and my day to day.
Love it. Andrew, today's conversation is going to be just super, conversational. We just want to learn more about how dietitians are thinking about gut testing. This is kind of a newer concept, right? And let's start with talking about you and your role and journey in the world of delivering nutritional care. So I'd love to start, we want to talk about you first before we get into gut microbiome testing in your practice. How did you find your way to into this career, to running this 10 plus location practice?
That's a wonderful question. So I started Case Specific. Wow, we are now in year. We're a little over 11. We turned 11 in January, so almost 12 years ago now, which is crazy to think about. Prior to that, I was in school to be a dietitian. When I was in school to be a dietitian, I didn't really have the intentions of creating a private practice right out of the gates. I knew in high school as an athlete, I was interested in fueling, I was interested in performance. I was always interested in helping people. And so my plan was to study nutrition and then go to med school. As I got into school and started shadowing and learning more about the medical world, I realized that I liked more of like the proactive aspects rather than the medical aspects. And so I started to shift towards more of the nutrition side. It became more of an interest to me. But if you asked me my junior year in college what I was going to do, I would have told you that I was going to go get a PhD in biochemical nutrition, and I was going to study and create supplements and make customizable supplements for people. And so I definitely bounced around the area of science and biochemistry and patient care. And in all honesty, towards my residency year, to become a dietitian, you have to do undergrad, master's degree, and then a 1 year internship, which is basically a residency as a way to think about it. During that year, I really fell in love with patient care. I got to work with patients and women, infants, children, and in clinical settings and at the food bank all over, different populations and demographics, and really enjoyed that human connection, human element. So I decided I was going to really refocus towards that patient care model. And so I started my private practice in the end of 2013. And it was initially a cash only practice that quickly was proven to be a massive need in our area. And so I started to scale it and network and meet people, and eventually you start to realize that there's a massive need for patient care. From there, preventive services started to become more common. Dietitians got recognized as medical specialists. And so I was on the front lines and in the cutting edge of insurance acceptance and started to really work through that. And over time, you trip your way forward for a long enough time, you start to look like you know what you're doing. But it's to say that it all started with a desire to help people and an interest in health. And that's iterated over the course of the past decade to bring us to where we are now.
Wow, that's super impressive. So always at the core of it, you were in love with nutritional sciences, and then
Yeah.
you thought about different career options, and then ultimately fell in love with patient care. Now, the reason why Chidozi and I sort of fell in love with you very early on in the way that you guys were delivering care was that you had this traditional set of tools that dietitians can tend to gravitate towards, right? You were really good at having these standard operating procedures across your locations around. We collect this in-depth information about the client. You may run blood testing, etc. When did you start thinking about what are other tools that maybe we could be bringing into your practice? Because you had gut testing on your radar before we met you.
Yeah. Yeah, we've always been a cutting edge private practice. And that's, I will say, I've always been very curious. I'm constantly learning. And, when I was in my master's degree, we were cracking the code of nutritional genomics. And so the area of nutrition was just at the start of what proved, what I thought was going to be not even its 15 minutes, but we'll call it its 30 minutes, right? We were starting to realize the importance of healthy lifestyle and the battling of chronic disease. And we had just started to scratch the surface of the microbiome. And so a lot of the functional nutrition and nutritional genomics courses I took in my actual education were things that were just happening. And so I was very fortunate, Malcolm Gladwell outliers, its success comes from the right time and a willingness to walk forward. I definitely had a right time situation. I came out of school very fascinated by nutritional genomics, very interested in the gut microbiome, and continuing to really watch how those things were moving forward. I also, through really natural iterations in our business, interacting with physician groups, started to realize where a lot of the current medical model was kind of handcuffing standard operating procedure to the net negative, which is to say that a lot of times people that are trying to be proactive about their care can't get the care they need or the investigations they need until they're too sick. And when you're on this proactive side where you're working with people that can't get that help and can't get that help, you start to feel helpless. And so my quest towards proactive panels and labs was really inspired by science and need. So prior to meeting you guys, we've done genetic testing over the years. We've done lab testing, micronutrient panels, all sorts of things like that. But the gut tests that are out there were extremely expensive and not particularly actionable would be the feedback that I would give, right? You could do, not to call out a specific name or term, but to do a GI map is $500 and you end up with this 80-page document that is, I guess, insightful if you're highly literate in the microbiome, but it doesn't give you any sort of actionable takeaways. It's not user friendly at all. And so there's only a certain person that can afford that can access that. And then my ability to train that, scale that, all of those things are obvious barriers. And so the gut side was kind of one of those things that we always wanted to do, but we were working with gastroenterologists that would focus on structure. We could focus on diet, and then we always wanted to sort of assess function. And so we would use supplements in other ways, but we always felt like we kind of lacked that tool just because of the cost barrier and the quality of the tool that was at our hands. So when we were introduced, it was just an instant oh my gosh, this is exactly what I've been looking for 5-8 years at that point. We had been on this quest. So lab testing and sort of surrounding the patient is a big piece of what we do. And again, right place, right time with our interaction, which is great.
Yeah, I love that. And I love this conversation of structure versus function, right? Because there's all this complex biochemical signaling that happens in the gut microbiome and these complex interactions. So talk us through when you decided, all right, I love this test, I'm going to introduce it into my practice. What are some of the practical steps that you had to take? Because you have a pretty big team. So how do you upskill everybody to sort of actually introduce a new tool?
Yeah, so we have about 30 dietitians in our practice across our 10 locations. And so that is a lot of providers that you want to make sure are highly literate and feel very comfortable with the test. I will give you guys your flowers, which is to say that you were there every step of the way to help train up. But it started, luckily, we've built an internal learning model. So one of my favorite parts of Case Specific is that we are a growth-minded, collaborative team of continuing education learners. We learn really well together, and I know you guys have gotten to witness that. I hire growth-minded, passionate people that are trying to advance forward, right? We're not trying to sell snake oil and live in conspiracy theories, but we will absolutely be literate in the cutting edge. So luckily, I have a team that's well-equipped to that and very used to it. And then through the years, as we've learned together, we've assembled an internal training called our CSNRDM, which is our case-specific dietitian sort of internal training, what it takes to be a CSN dietitian. And so when you guys came in and I met with you in Jadozi originally, and obviously you guys did a test with me, which was really cool because I got to learn with me as the patient, which for me personally is always a very positive, repetition to get in because I'll get more literate on what you guys are talking about a lot faster. But it's to say, once I saw the validity of the test and the value, then it becomes a game of how do you implement. And, from there, it really is majorly training the dietitians on it so they feel confident of it. It's one thing to say, hey, here's a product that you can recommend, or here's a test that you can do. It's another thing to really say, here's the test, here's how it works, here's case examples of what you would do with it, here's what you can take away as a dietitian. And then here are some of the implementations. And luckily, we already had a portal internally that is rooted in that type of systematization. So, through you guys helping us with some trainings and doing some trainings, and then every time any of our dietitians ordered a test for a patient, I went through it with them, and we have a lot of recordings of not necessarily reviewing test results. We obviously remain HIPAA compliant, but discussing the tests and the takeaways, and then building decision trees and all of those things with your help and through our own iterations. We've been able to create a ViTract portal hub where it's if you need training on it. So now any dietitian that starts working for us, they're going through that before they really even see patients. So we've built an internal system that educates well, but I can't thank you guys enough for being willing to meet with us and talk through it with us and troubleshoot and Q&A, and obviously offer office hours like you do, because our dietitians definitely need to orient to this test, get key takeaways of what they can do with it, and then start working with patients. And then just like me, right, they get those reps and they get better and better at it.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Andrew, let's get a little bit deeper into now, how are you thinking about introducing the test to your clients? Because I help onboard a lot of the practitioners that come our way. And some of the complexities and questions that I get frequently from practitioners is, okay, I love this tool. I clearly see how this is evidence-backed and how this can make a difference in how I can deliver care. But how do I start to think about offering this? Is it a baseline tool? Does it get added to everyone's assessment? Do I ask certain questions to sort of qualify a client into offering the test? And I think over the years, sort of what I've seen is kind of a different model across different practices. But what works best for you guys? How do you think about it?
Yeah, and I could see where different models could work for different people for sure. So in my mind, say you're running a specialty a dietitian practice that is a gut specialty, which means every patient that walks through the door has gut issues. They are knocking on your door because they have gut issues. I could see where you would implement this as a part of the onboarding. You're also in that example in a niche market where insurance coverage is going to be a bit scattered. So you're more likely a private pay, which means you're more likely dealing with a higher income earning population, which means an out of pocket test right out of the gates is not unexpected. So I can see where that model would make sense. We'll call it test first, talk later approach as for an ease.
Mm-hmm.
That does not work with case specific because we meet every patient demographic. So our company has a little bit of a broader patient vision in terms of who we're trying to help, right? Case specific. We meet people where they are. We try and do so financially as well as mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychologically, all that good stuff. So it's to say that we're the largest Medicaid provider in our state, and we work with low income people, and we are, the dietitian group that works with the Pittsburgh public schools. And so we work with firemen and teachers and police officers and like the strong middle class people that are trying to get access to information. Unfortunately, a $200 test is out of the question for a heavy majority of our population as a right out of the gates expectation. So for us, it is imperative that I train my team to have awesome tools in their toolbox, sit down with a person likely covered by insurance and costs are minimized to really understand who they are, what they're dealing with. And then we want to make the best recommendations we can as providers, also recognizing that finances may need to be a conversation regarding that. And that's where that has been an intentional expansion in our business, right? I have been growing to try and make dietitians more accessible, which isn't always the point of a specialized practice. So For us, when we think about that, I want my dietitians to be highly literate on the tool. I want them to understand what the benefits of this tool are. And then I want to tie that tool into what we call keywords or buzzwords, where it's concepts or phrases or conversations that pop up in consult that trickle downstream and decision tree. This is time for a ViTrac test. And so also noting our practice sees about 3,000 patients a month right now. And across that, we are seeing eating disorders and chronic disease management and weight loss and athletes, all the way from the, the little kiddo buzzing around like a bumblebee chasing a soccer ball to the professional athletes and, optimizing them in their off season. Like, we literally see everything. So same conversation. Gut is important. I would argue that every single person would benefit from this, but in their pie chart of pain, why are they sitting in my office? And then from that, what can we do to create a disproportionate ROI in terms of their patient care? If you work with someone long enough, this test is going to come up. I'll put it that way. And that's because, as you guys all know too well, it starts with the gut in a lot of ways. But most people's gut is thrown out of balance because their habits suck. And I'll just say that kind of bluntly, I guess.
Yeah.
It's just, at the end of the day, I would rather work with somebody up top if they have a financial struggle on habits, food flow, quality of food, all of these things that we know that need to happen regardless. We don't really need the extreme specifics at that juncture. And then through some of those more, we'll call them upstream means, what kind of reductions in the pie chart of pain are left, do we get? And then what is left in terms of chief complaints and symptomology? And when you have anybody that's complaining about gut issues, bloating, swelling, inflammation, erratic stools, periods of constipation, periods of diarrhea, even if we're hearing things like reflux or like there's the food sitting in their stomach, we're looking for reports that digestive upset is a piece of their complaint. And then from there, we do something called the 4 tiers of the digestive tract as a dietitian group, which is your brain, your stomach, your small intestine, your large intestine. And we try and hone into, is it this person that's living with a gun to their head, so they have a high acute distress response, adrenaline in their bloodstream, which is impeding their stomach and then trickling downstream? Well, if they live that type of lifestyle, their gut has definitely been suffering the consequences of that. But acutely, their stomach is likely not digesting, which means we may be better off working on dietary patterning and a betaine HCl supplement to help prop up the stomach so it can do its job, or work with them on the stress management, time management alongside a therapist. So we start upstream. And then as we get those things going momentum wise, that's when 3 months in, we'd go, okay, well, let's see where you're at with your gut, right? What do we need to resuscitate downstream? What was the damage done? Now that we know that upstream we're not doing any more damage, let's go down here and let's clean up what was already done. And so then you have the people that their symptomology is largely abdominal, right? It's to say they are clearly having, SIBO symptoms, or they're having gastrointestinal inflammation symptoms, gurgling or sudden dumping. Like, they're having those downstream symptomologies that would suggest that it may actually be a bacterial imbalance, as not just an unfortunate side effect of poor habits upstream over time, but actually like an acute issue right then and there. That is where this would get ordered first session. And so when we're sitting down with that patient in session 1, it's that motivational interviewing concept of resisting the writing reflex. They're going to give us 37 things that are wrong, and we have to pick the one thing that is most actionable with the biggest ROI to create confidence and build momentum forward. And so sometimes that is going to be, oh my gosh, we need to get your gut microbiome immediately, because we may be a probiotic imbalance away from saying checkmate. It may be, hey, let's get you into some core habits and really root cause those things. And then once we do, we're going to check in on your gut, and we're going to use this as a guide to basically help support your gut downstream from great habits. So that's how we choose to integrate it, through our 4-tiered system and through sort of that meet people where they are concept or mindset.
Yeah, I think that was really, really insightful, because we got to sort of go through this decision tree experience with you and kind of like get to experience what it's like being on your team and how you're thinking about that flow of, that journey you're taking the client on. Because, it is true that predominantly most of the practices that we work with, at least right now, are cash pay clinics, but there's a huge opportunity, we feel like, even in the reimbursable space, right? Which makes you a really interesting client to think through, like, for patients that are actually using Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement, how are they now accessing advanced testing like this?
Yeah,
Um,
that's an important piece, and I think it'll continue to develop. But I will say that you guys, by bringing in the price point you did, you made it infinitely more accessible. You took it from being something that was this pie in the sky. Hope you got seven figures parked somewhere, to now all of a sudden anybody with any amount of disposable income is going to be able to prioritize this, as if it's needed. And then people that are you know really struggling to try and make ends meet, this isn't out of the question. It just becomes a, we better be confident that it's going to create that disproportionate ROI, and we may want to exhaust some of the more speculative things upstream so that we can really justify its cost. But you guys have, you've included millions of people in what you've accomplished thus far, and I know you're just getting started, which is exciting.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's talk through. I think one of the things I also love about you is that even though you're a leader, you still are seeing clients so that you can stay in the reps of what it's like to actually deliver care, right?
Yeah.
I'd love to learn more about a specific case study or a specific client where you had a test result come back and you thought, wow, this actually paints the picture of maybe what's going on with this client from this root caused way that without testing would be really hard to drill down to.
Yeah, and I, like you said, I can give you quite a few, but I can definitely think of one off the cuff. I find that being patient facing is a really important piece of what we do. Luckily, I have great mentors, and I will just say that there was a doctor in particular that runs a large pediatric practice in the area who went. He was a mentor of mine, and he went full administrator a couple of years back for 3 months, and then went back to 10% patient facing. And the reason is because he said, I am so disconnected from my practice that I don't even know where to intervene. And so part of the reason I maintain a client base is because if we're going to be changing systems and trying to optimize, I need to see how they work in real time so that I can defend my dietitian team in conversations with the admin team. But it also, a lot of our great ideas that come in our podcast or in terms of finding resources like this, I love to be cutting edge, but I can only be cutting edge if I actually know who I'm being cutting edge for. And so remaining connected to the consumer, I think, is an important piece of a service-based business. And while I've scaled down dramatically, and I definitely have a very finite amount of time that I'm doing it, I can't help but note that a majority of my inspiration and direction kind of is drawn from that segment. And so I do think that there is something to be said about kind of keeping that as a piece in your growth puzzle, as an unwarranted sidebar. But from a patient population perspective, yeah, I've ordered this for dozens of people at this point personally, not just across our practice, but just as an individual provider. What I will note as a headline before I zoom in is these tests have shown and validated the suspicions of akkermansia across populations in such a dramatic way. That's been one of the biggest takeaways just from a broad stroke perspective. The amount of clients I have that have zero akkermansia in their gut, right? And that is, and we're sitting here with, with the fecal transplants, microbiome studies that have been done. And when we're looking at the utilization of GLPs and the supplement research around GLP-1s stimulating, supplements, the absence of akkermansia and then the following like reintroduction of it and the downstream effects of that is probably the most simple. It's the closest intervention to a light switch I've ever seen. I always say interventions are like dimmer switches, right? They don't just turn it on or off like it's a fade in, fade out kind of scenario. But the amount of clients, and I'm thinking of one in particular where I have a patient that I had personally worked with for quite a few years and started off as a weight loss client, lost 50 or 60 pounds, got to the top end of a healthy weight range, but was still body composition wise, still had some room to grow, dealt with some seasons of life, some stresses, some struggles, dealt with COVID, ended up on some antibiotics and ended up in this weird metabolic state where their habits were really positive, but their body was changing in a negative way. And so they started getting reflux, which is actually what triggered this, where like the habits weren't really justifying a reflux. It was more of like, what else is going on here? Not to mention the bloating and distension after meals. Like we started to basically think, okay, there's some clearly some microbiome stuff going on. And we pulled their labs or pulled the Vitrac test, and akkermansia at 0 was like the glaring, when we're thinking about the probiotic range. That one was the one that was glaring. This patient in particular, their bifido and their lacto and their Blautia and stuff wasn't particularly low or suppressed. It was like dominantly Akkermansia just didn't exist. And then you went down through their commensals, and it was that typical, what I like to call the trickle down economics of your gut microbiome, as your test shows. You know, inadequate amounts of probiotics leads to a disproportionate excess amount or over the top amount of commensals. And then you trickle down further, and it becomes the question of, did the opportunistic pathobionts take advantage of this opportunity? In her case, it was no. So we're sitting here going, okay, we don't need antibiotics, or the antibiotics she just took just like absolutely wiped it clean. She had no Akkermansia, and basically her gut diversity score was like in the toilet, right? So it was like, okay, she has very few. But all in all, we were getting back to eating a lot of produce, and we were doing a lot of lifestyle things already. It was so funny because she had been stuck at this weight for quite some time. We're talking months and months and months. And she had this reflux, and we literally just gave her an Akkermansia supplement for a month. I wanted to know what that was doing specifically. And she comes back and she sits down and she goes, I have never had such distinguished hunger and fullness cues in my entire adult life. I don't remember the last time I felt this hungry or full. Like, I get hungry, I eat food, and then I feel satisfied. I've never felt that way before as an adult. Like, I'm always insatiable. Like, I never really feel full. So like, within 2 weeks of taking this, I've just been like stopping. I've been leaving the plate with food still on it because I'm done. Like, not to mention, she had the largest month weight loss she had ever had. We did body comp on her, and there was a mixture of inflammation gone, which is not surprising, as well as fat loss. So she was obviously operating at a calorie deficit. There was some metabolic resuscitation going on. And then we could also see some anti-inflammatory properties of just literally putting that one lever in motion, right? So it's so hard in clinical care to strain through and try and pick, it's always multifactorial. Well, this was happening and this was happening and this was happening. This is about as like focal as I've seen, where it was like one input, one change, and then the outcomes are largely attributed to that input. And it was phenomenal to see. And so we had her do 6 months of it, and then we retook the test. And sure enough, Akkermansia was in its normal range. The others were as well. The commensals had been diluted. Her diversity score was up. And you just look at that and you go, that was the simplest input output I've ever seen. Most of them are not as simple as that, but man, is that an undeniably cool thing.
That's super cool. That's really cool. And Akkermansia, you're right. We see it chronically low across the population. And it's one of those tricky bugs where it can actually have a hard time growing in certain people's microbiomes. And so the fact that you were able to introduce it in this client, and, it looks like they were probably eating the right way. So they had the right prebiotics. It was able to colonize. It was able to grow. You were able to retest it. So that's a really cool story. Chidozi always says that the gut microbiome has a finite amount of space, right? So it was cool to see that with the introduction of that Akkermansia, how some of the other things kind of balanced out.
Yeah. You start to see where when they talk about the microbiome as this, it's meant to be a symbiotic relationship. And that's not just with us, that's with each other. And so you see where when I call them the big three at this point, but when your lacto, bifido, and Akkermansia are normal, that seems to really naturally help the Blautia and some of the others. And that does seem to keep the commensals in a very good place. And then that naturally creates a competitive environment where your pathobionts aren't going to do what they can because they're being oppressed. And so there's this natural synergy that can tend to take place. That's very interesting to observe when you can kind of nudge some of them. And I think one of the issues is that, again, how many people are like, oh, I take a probiotic, and then you find out like it's a line. So it's like one strain of bacteria. And I remember you guys telling me, it's like, well, we have like 500 in our gut, so 499 to go before we have this thing in check. But that is an example of the Akkermansia one being present, definitely, clearly had signals that better communicated with the others and worked their way down. What I'm really interested in with that patient in particular is we finished the 6 months of supplementing it. So we paused it. And now it's the question, which is, does did it actually like take hold and now it's actually stable? So in 6 months we're going to take it again and see if the Akkermansia is holding tight and living well, or if it starts fading. Because I do think that, to your point, I think some people are going to need to take it long term and some people may be able to resuscitate it. But I really love the ability to resuscitate and see if it stabilizes instead of assuming they need it long term, and then now we're causing an imbalance upstream from the good ones because we're giving too much Akkermansia. So I'm very curious to see if she's if her population takes hold and stabilizes for her.
Right, exactly. And you have that colonization resistance that's kind of different in different people. So for this person, their response could be different. And I've seen cases where, people continue to be on prebiotics, so they take like polyphenols, inulin, etc., just to like help with that colonization. But yeah, it's so interesting because some of the Akkermansias on the market are in the $100 plus range. So it's so unsustainable to be on it forever. It's almost better to be like, okay, if you invest in the testing and you see it stabilize, then you're saving hundreds of dollars of like being on it forever.
And that's also a reason for the testing, right? If we can do a test, which is put a supplement in and see what happens, but like those supplements are so expensive that I'd rather do the test and then give that recommendation from a place of strength. Now, good news is there are a couple brands coming out that I trust and have had a good working relationship with that are more affordable than some of those big names in the Akkermansia market. So it is becoming a more accessible piece. We're getting out of that phase where it's like one name and only them have it. Now we have like there's some other groups and they're reputable sources. So I am excited to continue to see sort of the natural supply and demand, lean towards the favor of the client. But we definitely try and be mindful of that, especially given the diversity of our population. There are people in our caseload that say, do what you got to do, run what you got to run. I'm not worried about it. And obviously, great place for them to be. And then there are people that are like, I need the help and I need to be as affordable as possible. And man, is that a good reason to help? So,
yeah. Yeah. I love that about your patient population because, dietitians play this critical role in the healthcare system where they are sort of playing at this preventative lever. They're delivering care in all sorts of different capacities. You could have a private practice, but you also could be working adjunctively with a gastroenterologist or with an oncologist or in a hospital care setting. And you kind of are the main sort of driver of building habits in terms of nutrition with the client.
Yeah, exactly. We get to interact with clients so much more than the traditional physicians, which again, especially when we're talking about intervention and integration of habits, like that is a repetitive thing. How many people have you heard say, I know what to do, I just need to do it? Like the what isn't really the difficult part, it's the how. And how is a troubleshooting game. It's an interaction between an experienced person that knows how to troubleshoot and knows how to navigate the pitfalls that are lifestyle and balance and health, and how to prioritize the things that matter and discern them from the things that are cool but not necessarily super valuable. It's a really, really hard thing to navigate, and so we're here to navigate the how. And so you get a clinical scenario where they say what needs to happen and then get a handout and say good luck, have a nice day. That does not lead to sustainable impact or change for most people. There needs to be that sort of troubleshooting phase. And we're proud to do that. We play that role on so many collaborative care teams. It's super fun. But even to your point, the relationship of a gastro, right? If we look at that one, gastroenterologists are imperative, right? They're one of our favorite specialists to work with, but their role is to troubleshoot the structural components of the gut, right? So when they have done all the scopes and done all the assessments, and they get to a point where they say, you have IBS, have a nice day. That's basically them saying there's nothing structurally wrong, but we're not declining or denying that you have symptomology. It's just not rooted in structure. We're not seeing any ulceration. We're not seeing any perforations. We're not seeing any strictures or fissures. We're not seeing anything that's structurally wrong. Good luck. And then you see the general advice of IBS. It's basically like, here's the list of foods that have affected everybody ever, which is basically all foods because different foods affect different people. So now they come into our office and we get to definitely analyze food, but we also get to analyze like the system itself. So not the structures, but how those structures interact systematically. What is the role of the stomach? What is the role of the small intestine? What is the role of the large intestine? And when you put food on the conveyor belt to go into that assembly line, what gears are turning, what mechanics are working, and is it creating the output expected? And we can fairly accurately figure out which part of the assembly line is busted, and then we can figure out what upstream might be contributing to that. And then through supplements or lifestyle or various testings, we may be able to prop it up, patch it up, and fix it. And then all of a sudden, we're in a good shape. And that's IBS is a dietitian's problem to solve, not a gastro's problem to solve, is a much more concise way to say what I just said.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, there's a lot of dietitians with the goal of wanting to actually collaborate with gastro and wanting to collaborate with oncology or derms or whatever that is. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what did that look like when you first started collaborating with these specialty providers?
Oh man, and still are. So that's a working relationship. It is tricky because you have a couple factors there. You have the constraints of the medical model that they're tied to. And so that can be the insurance-based limitations, right? One of the benefits of the Affordable Care Act was that it addressed massive gaps in care for low-income populations and effectively raised the ceiling. But in offering standard operating procedure to prevent these things from happening, it also stunted doctor and physician autonomy. So you now have clinics that are connected to insurance companies that are basically saying, if person presents with this, here's your decision tree you must follow. And so you get the big box medical groups that are then reinforcing that. So a lot of times you get practitioners like gastros that they're doing what they're allowed to do. And so that's one thing I want to call out is I'm not an anti-doctor person by any means, and I'm not an anti-med person by any means. It's recognizing the gaps and gaps in the system that are creating impediments to progress. And so what ends up happening is through a variety of delays that we could, rant about on a podcast someday, you end up with what percent of doctors currently acknowledge SIBO as a viable condition? It's not 50%. It's a minority of practitioners. Now, is that because they as individuals don't agree with it? Is it because they're plugged into systems that won't acknowledge it? Is it because insurance companies are waiting for certain degrees of evidence to exist before they will, do it? Or they need their insurance algorithm to make sure there's a financial benefit to actually addressing it before they're going to systematize it? So it's just to say this is a really complex system that unfortunately, when an autonomous private practice dietitian group wants to plug in, we get the gambit. We get the proactive physician that really wants to engage and is willing to, write the Xifaxan script if SIBO is confirmed, will write the tests, wants to look at this gut microbiome test and thinks it's fascinating and is interested in the literature and the data. And we get the ones that tell people that we're scam artists. And we get everything in between. Like we've literally had in the last 6 months, we had a client bring a test to a doctor and they said, you got scammed. And that was their clinical recommendation, was there's nothing structurally wrong with you and you just wasted a whole bunch of money working with a dietitian, which obviously is a testament to lack of knowledge on their part. And side note, they're now on our do not refer list, because why would we ever recommend a patient go see someone that close-minded? We're not over here selling snake oil. We're giving people pathways forward when they've spent years cornered by a medical model that's not listening or not supporting. So gastroenterology as an example, but we'll just call it medical specialty and coordination of care, is a networking game. It's a networking game. It is meeting as many practitioners as possible. It is finding the ones that are progressive, that are growth-minded, that are open-minded, that like to play in the sandbox, and it's reinforcing that relationship. And they are not one out of, they are not 1 out of 2. I'll put it that way. You've got to go search. You've got to find them. I have the blessing that CASE has been around for 12 years, and we definitely built a reputation that precedes us in a lot of conversations. And so a lot of times doctors come to us now, which is, like I said, I'll count my stars for that and won't take that for granted. But we continue to be proactive in our outreach because we're always looking for high quality practitioners that we can work with. We always play in the sandbox best when there's others playing with us, having physicians to coordinate and collaborate with. But it takes a certain type of practitioner, and it takes them being plugged into a system that's willing to talk. And I will say that in Western Pennsylvania in particular, we have a very unique insurance landscape. Looks like a patchwork quilt all over the US, but where we are, there's some big boxes that account for over 85% of total insured. There's 2 companies that have over 85% of insured patients across the region. So we're not in the world where there's 5 or 6 or 7 companies competing. We're in a world where there's 2 that own it and 3 that you may bump into. I bet you can imagine those 2 companies probably also have a whole lot of say and sway over the clinical processes that exist. So we've definitely had our work cut out for us in our landscape here in Western PA. But man, you persist, you still find them. So we've been fortunate. There's definitely a need for more. Like every time I meet with my lead RDs, it's like, who are you missing in your referral network? And it's like, I've got a gastro in, 2 towns over, but in our current 15-minute radius, we don't have one that's, willing to have the conversation or willing to engage. So it's a networking game, and I like to say we work with other givers. We're a giver focused organization. We pour into our patients, we pour into our collaborative. Obviously, even collaborations like you guys, it is just how we go first. That's how we operate. But you do find when you interact, there's a lot of docs that they have, whether it's an ego complex or whether it's what you see is all there is, bias and heuristic that makes them closed-minded, or whether it's the shackles of powers that be that they're affiliated with. We can see the potholes in this landscape of trying to meet and create a collaborative care team.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because the insurance reimbursable sort of space is very complex, right? And I think there's a lot of dietitians on this call or other practitioners that can benefit from learning more of the behind the scene of how it all works. So we really appreciate that. Now, I think I'm going to jump into the questions that we have from some practitioners on the call.
Do it.
Christy wants to know, he mentioned that he's treating all demographics. Can Vitrac be appropriate for infants, toddlers, or what is a good recommendation? Do you see a lot of infants and toddlers, Andrew?
Not a ton. We do see a little bit. So infants, it's typically more, I like to say we're typically counseling mom and dad, reassuring them that they're not screwing up royally. That's kind of the main reason infants come in. We don't have any big infant-based acute referral contracts, so we're not dealing with any really medically pertinent infant stuff. It's more just thriving and troubleshooting, breastfeeding recommendations, diet for mom in that situation, transitioning to foods, so more of that stuff. So we have not utilized this type of testing in that population. Toddler-wise, it's more of our picky eating and that kind of thing is what we get referrals for. So we tend to be the one that works on what are the adjacent foods and all of those kind of things. And so we have dominantly done gut testing in adults. We have done it in a couple older teens, but we have not done it in anybody under 16 to date.
Okay. And I think just to chime in from that microbiome perspective, if you're looking to test young children, we recommend testing from the age 5 and up with the Vitrac test, because at that point you have the microbiome sort of starts to mimic the compositionally that of an adult's microbiome, because you want the ranges to make sense. And then if you're doing a test for, a 1-year-old child, right? You're going to see that, of course, the test will be accurate in the sense that we'll pick up and report what's in that kid's microbiome. But when you're that young, kids tend to skew very heavily towards, for example, having a very high amount of bifidobacterium, right? And so just expect that if you do that test, the ranges are going to be different, and you're going to have to kind of put in a little bit of research work to figure out what the right ranges are approximately that you're looking for. Okay, and then there's actually a lot of interest to learn about that Akkermansia supplements that you're talking about. I think people are kind of fed up with spending a lot of money on Akkermansia. So what are some brands that you like and that you use?
Yeah, I was going to say, would you prefer me to say I'm here, or would you prefer me to send you links to send out? I'm happy to do either, but
I mean, it's totally fine to mention them. Yeah.
Cool. Just wanted to make sure. But yeah, so the 2 that we have found that we use that we know work and actually have shown the retention of Akkermansia is the Code Age brand, CODEAGE. It is in FullScript. So for any of you providers that utilize FullScript, we use FullScript through our health record. That one is available through there. And then there's a brand called Tonic. It's TONIQ. It is a little black tub, and they have a whole bunch of of stuff, but like they have really good core like micronutrients like magnesium glycinate, and they do berberine and all sorts of like single ingredient products. But they're like a third party purity tested like quality brand. They have an Akkermansia 10 billion, and then they actually just came out with a new product that's called, I'm going to forget, something 2000, Biome 2000 maybe. And it's Akkermansia with berberine. So it's kind of like combo paired, which is kind of neat. But I can speak to their Akkermansia, their 10 billion. That one is on Amazon. So when we have clients that want to go through full script that can, we tend to use Code Age. If we have clients that are more prone to the Amazon world, we're going to use that TONIQ tonic brand. And then the third one is the one that everyone knows about that costs $75 to $100. So no need to beat that dead horse, so to speak.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, Linda wants to know, what are the factors that affect why Akkermansia does not grow or exist in the gut? Do you think it's a combination of diet, lifestyle, stress? What recommendations can you make to cultivate a better balance of Akkermansia, and can food help with that?
That's a great question. I'm going to answer for me, but I definitely think that that's one that you two need to talk about beyond even my understanding. So, one of the things from my understanding of it is that Akkermansia is a lot more sensitive to antibiotics than some of the other bacteria. And it is also less diverse in terms of its species. So, like Lactobacillus is not one bacteria, it is dozens and dozens. Bifido is dozens and dozens. Akkermansia is just Akkermansia. So, from what I would see is we definitely live in what we like to call the antibiotic generation, where we tend to, I would never criticize antibiotics because they are like one of the biggest checkpoints in medical history. So it's not to say this isn't an antibiotic rant, but it is to say, do we recommend them too quickly, too aggressively, and too often? Probably. Like they may be a little bit commonplace right now. We use them maybe a bit more proactively than we should because it's like they get the job done, but then we've just like ignored the second and third order consequences of what happens when every time you have some sort of infection, you just get a topical antibiotic or you pop a week of antibiotic. And antibiotics are essentially a nuclear weapon. They are not specified to one bacteria. They just tend to kill bacteria. And so from what I understand, Akkermansia is a bit more sensitive, and I think it gets hit a bit harder. So I think in a population that we can see over the last 75 years has been given antibiotics more and more and more, and then also eats a diet that has less and less of the fiber needed to support the thriving of these organisms, as well as some of the the micronutrients and other things. I think we've created a landscape where they get bombed and they die, and then they don't come back because from my understanding, they don't for example, we can go get lactobacillus from some yogurt. Like it's in food. Like when we think about fermented foods, there are certain bacteria, but Akkermansia is kind of like it's in your gut if it's in your gut. And then once it's gone, it's gone. And there's only one way to really put it back at that point. And that's where I know the fecal transplant tests kind of were the original highlight of, oh man, these, higher BMI people had less Akkermansia than the lean people. And when we did these fecal transplants, the presence of Akkermansia started to create a biologic change. So those are some of the key pieces. What I would love to hear more about, and again, this is just me scratching the surface, it would seem that there is absolutely a genetic tendency towards having robust amounts of Akkermansia, which would be to say, if mom and dad have robust amounts of Akkermansia, procreate, have a child, and then breastfeed that child, the likelihood that that child develops a robust Akkermansia is high, where if a parent combo have lower, they're not passing it along. And so I do feel like that plays a role, but I don't know that I could ever even attempt to estimate the implications there.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting to hear your perspective, Andrew. Super interesting. I'm going to chime in with can food help? And then I would love Josie to chime in as well. Of course, food can certainly help. You have Akkermansia that likes to feed on specifically certain ingredients. And so part of what we pride ourselves in having launched this test and these two tests is we actually will scour through the literature and then in our recommendation section, give you a sense of these are certain nutritional suggestions, supplements, probiotics, prebiotics that specifically Akkermansia will thrive on. So yes, food can help. Anything that you want to add to that conversation, Chidozie?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very brilliant question. I mean, one of the very key things that actually impacts the enrichment of Akkermansia is, the thickness of the mucus layer of your gut lining. As you guys know, it's called there's a species called Akkermansia muciniphila. That's the dominant species in humans, and they feed on mucin. And it's not uncommon to see some people actually have very low thickness of that mucus substrate. If you're doing low fiber intake, if even we've seen this a lot of people who are going into menopause where there's decline in estrogen, and that actually lowers the thickness. So what tends to happen is that you've deprived that organism of one of its substrates, all right? So we tend to see that. Another thing we tend to see is we also know that when some bile acids, which are eventually transformed, some secondary bile acids actually do have the potential to inhibit Akkermansia. Andrew mentioned another potential, which is the use of antibiotics, which have off-target effects that can actually clear out. Sometimes too, what you tend to see there is competition. Competition within that gut microenvironment can also reduce because we know that there are some organisms that actually literally love to feed on that mucin as well, like Ruminococcus navus is one of them, and there's a lot of species of Bacteroides that feed on mucin. And so what happens is that they're taking away the carbon and nitrogen source for Akkermansia to actually feed upon. And Akkermansia, as a lot of you know, one of the reasons why it became really difficult to grow as a probiotic is because they're very fastidious. They grow anaerobically, that is to say, in the presence of little amount of oxygen, they will die. And so, there is the oxygen gradient in the gut that is not hypoxic enough, can actually impact the growth of Akkermansia there. And in terms of the foods that we know that can actually enrich Akkermansia, very well established in literature are chitosan-rich foods. All right, so foods that are rich in chitosan. We also know that foods like barley, in terms of specific ingredient that Linta was talking about, we do know that inulin is actually very well established to actually enrich Akkermansia. And that's why when you buy some Akkermansia probiotics, it's unsurprising that you see inulin added as another substrate there to actually enrich that enrichment in the gut microenvironment. And lastly, some lifestyle changes actually really help with increasing Akkermansia. Exercise, there are tons of studies that have shown how exercise actually enhances the growth of Akkermansia, and intermittent fasting. And that's why we tell people if you have super high levels of Akkermansia, we encourage that you temporarily pause doing intermittent fasting. Because what happens when you're doing intermittent fasting is that the only carbon and energy source for your Akkermansia then becomes the glycans of that mucin in the gut epithelium, and so that further enriches the growth of Akkermansia. So yeah, I just wanted to speak to that.
Love it. Super interesting. So it's like, it kind of pulls in part of Andrew's answer around, you're not going to pick up yogurt and get Akkermansia from it because it's anaerobic.
Yeah. No, thank you. Those are those. I always learn something every time I get to chat with you guys, which is why I love it so much. Because that's in my brain, it's Akkermansia is like apples and oatmeal because of the inulin, but it's to say that that's to feed the Akkermansia, not to get the Akkermansia. And so we've definitely, for patients that are low in it, we're definitely trying to create an anti-inflammatory environment to hopefully help that gut be more optimized so that it can be a more nourishing site. And then we definitely are prioritizing fibers, but we found that we need to supplement the Akkermansia if we're going to get it to budge.
Love it. I think that is it for all the questions as well. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. This was a really, really interesting conversation. Usually we delve into a specific case and a specific use case and the microbiome and its in sort of interaction with that specific use case. And I think in this case, we were able to talk more about the practicalities of what it's like to actually be a practicing RD, your interaction with clients, insurance, specific case studies. I thought that was really interesting. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure. And again, I hope it was helpful for everyone listening.